Hi guys, so we're going to pick up where we left off, talking about how different taxa acquire and process nutrients. Just as a recap of where we've been is all in gray. So we've talked about the different nutrients that all organisms need. We've talked about some of the generalities of nutrient acquisition and the different types of trophies that are out there. And so if you haven't watched the previous lectures that cover this information, please take a look at those before you go into this lecture, where today we're going to be talking about adaptations for acquiring and transporting nutrients. Okay, so the specific adaptations that organisms have to acquire and transport nutrients throughout their cells or throughout their body. So how do organisms acquire and transport essential nutrients? So you may think it's like this, you just eat it and it gets in your belly and then it gets spread out. And for a lot of organisms, that is the case. But you have to think that there's also lots of different organisms out there. There's unicellular organisms that don't have a belly. There's photosynthetic organisms that don't necessarily have to eat other organisms, so they can be autotrophic. And there's things like fungi that are out there that are just these sort of hyphae and roots that spend a lot of their life as a sort of hyphae system, and they don't have a belly either. So we're going to talk about how different organisms acquire nutrients. So how do they get nutrients out of the environment and into their bellies, so to speak, even if they don't have a belly? And how do these organisms then transport all of these nutrients to each individual cell so that they can get the nutrients they need to sort of process their metabolisms and work down at the individual cellular level? So not only how do they acquire nutrients, but how do they transport these nutrients throughout their bodies and cells? And there's a couple of general themes that we'll cover in acquiring and transporting nutrients. Number one, surface area to volume ratios is hugely important for acquiring and transporting nutrients, especially acquiring nutrients, okay? So organisms typically need a very high surface area to volume ratio to efficiently exchange gases and nutrients with the environment, and also to get gases and nutrients into and out of each individual cell. So whether you're looking at the inside of your intestine where you're absorbing nutrients and you have all these little sort of things that are like fingers, these are called villi. These greatly increase the surface area to volume ratio of your intestine for nutrient absorption. Okay, and same deal with lungs. Lungs have a ton of surface area with them to exchange gases with the environment. Okay, so every sort of organ system or system that we look at that exchanges nutrients or gases typically has a very high surface area to volume ratio. So it's a very important theme that we'll touch on over and over again. Surface area to volume ratios and structure relating to function. Another important theme are trade-offs, okay? So we've talked about evolutionary trade-offs before, that things come in a benefit in one aspect but have costs in other aspects, okay? And so with nutrient acquisition and transport, often things that organisms have evolved to acquire and transport nutrients also come at a cost. So an example of this might be oxygen and CO2 exchange in plants often also results in water loss. So we talked about this idea of stomata and water being lost through stomata, but stomata also having to stay open so they can pull in CO2 for photosynthesis. And we know that photosynthesis happens in the leaves of plants. And so if you have a really big leaf, you can do a ton of photosynthesis and make a lot of sugars, but that's going to come at the cost of losing a lot of water. Okay, so this is a trade-off here where you can do more photosynthesis, but you'll also lose more water. And that's why you'll often see trends like this, where in very tropical areas where there's lots of water and it's not a limiting factor, you can have plants with huge leaves because they're not worried about losing so much water. That trade-off doesn't exist. Whereas in a desert habitat, leaves are reduced basically down into individual thorns. Cacti don't even have leaves. It's the stem that does photosynthesis because they need to conserve water as much as possible. And so this is the idea of a trade-off. And this also hits on another major theme, which is that environment really matters, okay? So just as an example, gas exchange from the air versus water poses very different challenges depending on what type of environment you're in, whether you're in a terrestrial environment versus an aquatic environment. So in a terrestrial environment, the big sort of issue that you need to deal with gas exchange is drying out. So lungs have to exchange gases. We know that gases get exchanged through an organism's lungs if they have them. And lungs are on the inside of our body. And one of the major reasons for that is because lungs need to stay moist. And if we put them outside of our body to exchange with gases with the air, they would dry out really quickly. Whereas in aquatic habitat, they don't have that same pressure of drying out. And so some organisms will actually have external gills that are exposed to the aquatic habitat so they can exchange gases more readily, and they don't have to worry about drying out because they're out there in the water. And so you have this sort of trade-off of gas exchange versus drying out, and you have different environmental contexts that change sort of how much each of those sort of costs and benefits weigh. Okay, I also want to talk about some general mechanisms that organisms use to obtain and transport nutrients. And this is true across sort of all organisms. So at the cellular level, for all organisms, whether a unicellular organism or a multicellular organism, nutrient molecules have to move across cell membranes. And they can move across cell membranes. So remember, they got to move across membranes to get into the cell and across membranes to get out of the cell. So from the environment into the environment. And they can do this via diffusion. So simple diffusion is basically just molecules moving down their concentration gradient from a high concentration to a low concentration. And some molecules can move across a cell membrane through simple diffusion. And this process does not require energy on an organism's part. Okay, so it doesn't have to invest energy for molecules to diffuse into or out of a cell, as long as those molecules can freely move across a cell membrane and are moving down their concentration gradient from a high concentration to a low concentration. Organisms also use active transport to move molecules across a cell membrane. So active transport often involve, or always involve, investment of energy in ATP, and often involve these carrier proteins or carrier molecules that can basically move a molecule that typically can't freely move across a cell membrane through simple diffusion. And oftentimes, this will involve the use of energy to move things up their concentration gradient. So sometimes it'll go from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Sometimes it'll go from a lower concentration to a higher concentration. But in any aspect, active transport is always going to require energy. And this is a key aspect of it that differs it from diffusion. So diffusion does not require energy. Active transport does. And eukaryotes, okay, so eukaryotes use diffusion active transport, but they can also use that dynamic endomembrane system that we talked about to move nutrients within cells. So remember, the dynamic endomembrane system is basically a system of membranes within the cell. So endo means within, that can move nutrients around. So we talked about this idea that there's an endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, vesicles, and all of these things can sort of pinch off and move nutrients around in the cell or move proteins around in the cell. And so this endomembrane system that's dynamic, that can move around, is a useful way to transplant nutrient molecules around and also move wastes out of a cell. And that's something that only eukaryotic cells can do. Only eukaryotic cells have this dynamic endomembrane system. Prokaryotic cells do not. Unicellular organisms can also acquire and transport nutrients via diffusion, active transport, and also phagocytosis. So when we're talking about, so this was talking about transport at the cellular level, here we're talking about how a unicellular organism acquires and transports nutrients. So unicellular organisms will use diffusion, they'll use active transport, and eukaryotic organisms can also do phagocytosis. So remember, phagocytosis is basically just sort of taking this other organism and pinching off some cell membrane around it to engulf that other organism or that other piece of food or that other nutrient or whatever it is, and then it can be broken down further within the cell. And phagocytosis requires a dynamic endomembrane system, and only eukaryotes can do that because only eukaryotes have this dynamic endomembrane system. When we talk about complex multicellular organisms and how they acquire and transport nutrients, they also use diffusion. They also use active transport. So remember, these complex multicellular organisms have to transport nutrients into and out of each of the individual cells that are living and metabolizing throughout that entire organism, okay? And so nutrients have to get into and out of those individual cells through diffusion and active transport, and then they'll transport all these sort of nutrients and waste also throughout the entire organism through bulk flow. So for example, we talked about the vascular tissues that are in plants that'll sort of move sugars and waters and nutrients all through the plant so that those nutrients can get to every single individual cell throughout the plant. Okay, so which of the following, given the previous information, is incorrect? If you said B, prokaryotic organisms use a dynamic endomembrane system to transport nutrients throughout their cells, that is the incorrect statement. So only eukaryotic organisms have a dynamic endomembrane system, and that's why this one is false. All the rest of these statements are in fact true. Okay, so as a recap, in previous lectures, we talked about all of the different types of nutrients that organisms need and why they need them. We talked about generalities of nutrient acquisition and the different types of trophy that organisms have to acquire nutrients. And then in this lecture, we talked about the general adaptations for acquiring and transporting nutrients and the themes for these general adaptations. So surface area to volume ratios, trade-offs, and the importance of environment, terrestrial versus aquatic. And then we also talked about some of the general mechanisms to get nutrients into cells and also to those cells in the first place. So we talked about active transport, diffusion, phagocytosis, and bulk flow. And we talked about the different types of organisms that use these different mechanisms.